Amen. Amen. Ruth chapter 1 verse 7 sums up what we want to look at today. Verse 7 we read concerning Naomi. Wherefore she went forth out of the place where she was, and her 2 daughters-in-law with her, and they went on the way to return unto the land of Judah. There was a certain businessman, and he was asked what was it that made him so successful in business. He had done very, very well in business, very, very successful. And so he was asked, well, look, how did you become so successful? And he said this. He said, by making good decisions. By making good decisions. The questioner continued, well, how did you learn to make good decisions? And he said, well, by experience. I learned by experience to make good decisions. And the individual then said, well, how did you get the experience to make these good decisions? And the man replied very simply, by making plenty of bad decisions. I learned from making plenty of bad decisions eventually what a good decision was. And I think that this family really have learned that lesson. It has taken an awful lot of time, but they have made plenty of bad decisions. The husband and wife have made plenty of bad decisions, and even then the children, that bad decision making has filtered down to their children, because we saw it last week. They too made plenty of bad decisions. Started off, of course, with Elimelech and Naomi. And long even before they left Bethlehem, we saw that they made the first bad decision, which was to depart from the Lord in their heart. Things were getting hard, things were getting tough. There was a famine in the land. And so they made the decision to, first of all, to stop trusting the Lord, to stop looking to Him in difficult times. That was their first bad decision. But of course, eventually we saw last week they swapped the house of bread for the washpot, that is Moab. But the bad decisions, they kept on coming, didn't they? Because of course, Mahlon and Chilion, they were born and they were raised in Moab. And eventually they too would make bad decisions. They made the bad decision to marry outside of the will of God, to not marry followers of the Lord, to marry essentially those who were not converted, those who were not saved, and to marry really pagans, to marry Orpah and Ruth, damsels from Moab. And we saw last week that God took drastic action. It was enough with the bad decisions. And God, unfortunately, had to take the further bad decisions out of the hands of this family by taking Elimelech, Mahlon, and Chilion before they would impact really anybody else making any more bad decisions. And all of this led to Ruth making a good decision. All of these bad decisions and the results of these bad decisions, they led to Ruth making a good decision, because Ruth, we see her, or Naomi rather, we see her here. What is she doing? Verse 6, she hears that God has visited His people and giving them bread. And then verse 7, she went forth out of the place where she was, and her 2 daughters-in-law with her. In other words, Naomi, she makes this decision, a good decision. I'm going to go back. She turned from her sin. She turned from all that she had let down the Lord in. She turned even from the heartache of the results of her sin. And she makes her way. She starts to make her journey back to the house of bread. Now, verse 7, if you pay close attention to that, you'll see that there was 3 who left. She went forth, verse 7, out of the place where she was, and her 2 daughters-in-law with her. They went on the way to return to the land of Judah. So there were 3 who went at the start. There were 3 who left Moab. Naomi and her 2 daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth. But verse 19 reads this. So they too went until they came to Bethlehem. So it seems that 3, immediately they started to leave Moab. They made some small steps in the journey. Each 3 made an initial good decision after plenty of bad decisions. But sadly, verse 19, only 2 arrived in Bethlehem. You see, one made another bad decision, Orpah. She decided that she would not go the whole way to the house of bread. She would not return to Bethlehem. And what I want you to see here is this, is it seems that, at least in my understanding of it, it seems that as they leave Moab a little while, as they make the first footsteps out of Moab, as they have Moab a little bit in the rearview mirror, and as Bethlehem is up ahead, it seems that Naomi and Ruth and Orpah, these three widows, they're brought really to a crossroads in their lives. What's the rest of my life going to look like? Where am I going to live? Who am I going to be with? What am I going to do with my life? These hardships and that initial leaving of Moab had brought them each to that fork in the road moment in each of their lives. And they all made decisions. Some made good decisions, Naomi and Ruth. And sadly, Orpah, she made another bad decision. And we read of her turning back from initially following the Lord. And you know, God does this with you and with us all at certain times in our lives. And sometimes it is through hardship. Sometimes it can't even be through death, as it was here. Not all the time, but sometimes there's a change in circumstance. There's a change in what happens. There's a change in job, a change in home. There's a change in our family. There are things that come our way, and we're forced, as it were, to this crossroad, this D-Day moment, as it were, in our lives, where we have to make decisions. And the decision really is this, is who we are going to be and what we're going to amount to before God. And there are certain junctures in our lives when this happens, you know. Think of young people, and they come to that stage, and they're at their A-levels, they're thinking university, they're thinking employment, they're thinking technical college, whatever. And you will find this, between the age of 18 and 22, subconsciously, young people, and young people, listen to me here. Young people, you make that decision. What kind of a Christian? Am I even going to be a Christian? You make that big decision in those formative years in your life. And there's some here today, and you're there. You're at that crossroads in your life. You're making decisions. What am I going to do with my life? But there's a greater decision for us all. And that decision is this. What am I going to amount to before the Lord? Am I going to be like Ruth and cleave to the Lord and head straight, as it were, and follow after the Lord? Or am I going to be like Orpah and turn back and leave off from following the Lord? You see, in these three widows, you have three different types of people. You have Naomi, who really is a backslider, who is restored truly to the Lord. You have Orpah, who is an unbeliever, who goes back to her other gods. And you have Ruth, the new believer, the individual who believes on the Lord and follows after the Lord and is going to follow him no matter what. And that's what we want to look at today. We want to just very simply look at these three different widows as they're leaving the washpot that is Moab and learn some lessons from each of them. Think with me first about Naomi, the discouraging widow. Naomi, the discouraging widow. And you'll see what we mean when we call her a discouraging widow as we look at her. Verse 8. Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, "Go, return each to your mother's house. The Lord deal kindly with you as ye have dealt with the dead and with me." Verse 11 as well. Naomi said, "Turn again, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Are there yet any more sons in my womb, that they may be your husbands?" So we saw last week that Naomi, when she was in Bethlehem initially, she was a pleasant lady. That's what her name means, pleasant. It seems she was content to dwell with her husband. She was content to be that lovely, that pleasant lady in the home, content to support her husband, etc. She was just a pleasant influence, a pleasant lady to be around, a pleasant Christian woman. But of course, she made that decision to go to Moab. And eventually her two sons marry my two daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth. Now they're different. They're not followers of God, not followers of the Lord, not followers of Jehovah. They are from Moab. And so in a sense, they're from a different country, but they have a totally different mindset and outlook on life. They had grown up, after all, in a washpot. They never really knew what it meant to worship the one true and living God, and their lives really were lives of spiritual barrenness and darkness. Yeah, you could say providentially they had a little bit of an influence with Mahlon and Chilion and Naomi, Elimelech, but let's face it, they were backslid in the family. They were not a great influence. And it seems now that here are two grieving women. I mean, of course you feel for them. They have lost their husbands. They have lost a father-in-law as well. And it's very obvious they're a very tight-knit, close family. God has really struck a difficult blow to this family. And it seems here that these two daughters-in-law, Ruth and Orpah, they're looking to Naomi for direction. They're really looking at Naomi. Of course, Naomi, she names the name of God, names the name of Christ. While she's backslidden and far away from God, there would have been something about her, let's not forget. There would have been certain boundaries. And so they're looking to Naomi, really, this older Christian lady. Though she may be far from the Lord, yes. They're looking to this older Christian lady really to see how does she deal with the loss of her husband. And how does Naomi deal with it? Well, she comes back to the Lord through it. And then, as we have seen, she starts to make off the journey back home. She wants to get back to the house of bread. And so it seems that here are these two daughters-in-law, and they just observe this Christian lady who God has worked in her heart, and they just follow her. They follow her. They follow her. Verse 8, now Naomi, as they begin to follow her and kind of tag along with her, so to speak, as we would say. Verse 8, Naomi acknowledges that they have been very good daughters-in-law. The Lord deal kindly with you as ye have dealt with me, with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that ye may find rest, each of you, in the house of your husband. So Naomi acknowledges, you've been good daughters-in-law. You've dealt well with the dead. You've dealt well with my two sons. I've observed you. You've looked after them well. But do you see what she really says here? Essentially saying, look, don't follow me. As I'm following the Lord back home, don't follow me. And as you read this portion, really from verses 8 through 12, a number of times Naomi says to Ruth and Orpah, who are still not saved at this point, the Lord has still not worked in Ruth's heart. She essentially says to these two unbelievers who have had a real hard time, return. Verse 8, go return to your mother's house. Verse 10, they say, well, look, we're going to go with you. No, we're not going back. Then verse 11, turn again. Turn again, my daughters. Verse 12, it's repeated again. Turn again, my daughters. Go your way. You see, Naomi, the Lord is beginning to work in her heart, yes, but she's still definitely not what she once was with the Lord. She's not. And so do you see Naomi here, this lady who is probably still in some form of a backslidden state? Yes, the Lord has begun to stir up the embers in her heart, but she's not where she once was with the Lord. And more than that, she's still bitter. How do I know she's still bitter? Well, when she comes eventually to Naomi, or to Bethlehem, verse 20, call me not Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty hath dealt very bitterly with me. So what I want you to see here is Naomi. She's a discouraging widow. Why? Because she is full of bitterness still. Bitterness about the past. Bitterness about how the Lord has maybe dealt with her in the past. Bitterness about providence in the past. Bitter about circumstances in the past. And it has resulted in her still not being where she should be with the Lord. And here is a bitter, backslidden believer. Yes, she's a believer. But a number of times she's actually actively discouraging other believers from following the Lord, or other individuals from seeking after God, Orpah and Ruth want to know more. They want to taste maybe what life is like in the house of bread. They've never been there themselves. They've only ever known pagan upbringing, pagan life. They're certainly inquisitive about life as a believer, but a number of times Naomi says here, in her bitterness and in her backslidden state, return again. Don't follow the Lord. That's really what she's saying. Don't follow the Lord. And she is actively and actually discouraging people from following the Lord. And you know, this is what happens when individuals either become backslidden or even become bitter. What you do is you actively discourage people from seeking after God. When you get into that state where really people look at you and they want to see the loveliness of Jesus Christ in you, and that's what they're seeking, by the way. If people look at you as a Christian, they want to see something of the beauty of Christ in your life. They want to see the joy of sins forgiven. But when you get into a bitter state, and of course very often bitterness does lead to backsliding. It does. When you get into an embittered state or even a cold at heart state, you know what you really do? You're like Naomi, and you discourage people. You discourage people from following the Lord. Now you may say to me, well, I've never actively said to someone, well, look, don't follow the Lord, and it's hard to be a Christian. You may never have done that, but in your life, you do this. You may not actively discourage people, but you do passively discourage people from following the Lord. When you become bitter about how God has maybe dealt with you in the past, or you're far away, this is the result. You think of Daniel, and you know, Daniel had an awful lot of hardship in his life, didn't he? Daniel in the Bible. Through no fault of his own, through no sin of his own, he's taken as a captive, just probably as a teenager, to Babylon. He is kept in Babylon for 70 years. Spends his whole life really and not where he wants to be. And yet remember Daniel. Daniel walked with God. He honored the Lord throughout his days in Babylon. He obviously wasn't perfect, but he honored the Lord. And it seems that individuals, even as he held office, even as he was really promoted to a position of kind of prime minister or president, as he held office, it seems that individuals looked at him and they began to follow the Lord. Now, how do I know that? Daniel 12 verse 3 speaks of Daniel turning many to righteousness. Turning many to righteousness. Oh, Daniel could have grumbled like many of the other believers there in Babylon. You read of that in the Psalm 139. We were like them that weep just by the river, etc. But no, Daniel didn't grumble. Daniel didn't become bitter about these things. He turned many to righteousness. He walked with God in the midst of his hardship. He did not become bitter. He became better. And he became a good influence. 1 Corinthians 4 verse 9, the Apostle Paul says this: I think that God hath set forth us the apostles last, as it were appointed to death, for we were made a spectacle to the world, to angels and to men. And the word spectacle here in the Greek, it has the idea of a theatre. You see what Paul's saying? Saying our lives as believers were just like a theatre being played out in the great or a play being played out in the great theatre or amphitheatre of this world. Even angels were watching on, never mind men. And so the question we must ask today is this: are we embittered about something in the past? Some hard providence that God has dealt with us, some hard blow that we have maybe felt? Remember this, that bitterness will always impact others. You may not actively be like Naomi and discourage individuals, but passively you do it. Robert Ingersoll, the great atheist, notorious for his attacks on the Bible, he had a godly aunt. Her name was Sarah, full of aches and pains as she was getting on in life, and yet she was a joyful Christian. And you know, Robert Ingersoll wrote a book against God and for atheism. And in the flyleaf of this book, he wrote this: if all Christians had lived like Aunt Sarah, perhaps this book would never have been written. If all Christians had lived like Aunt Sarah, perhaps this book would never have been written. Be very careful when you go through a tough time in your life, believer, or when you're far from God, because all the while you're like Naomi. You're discouraging people from following the Lord. Naomi, the discouraging widow. Think with me secondly about Orpah here, the departing widow. Orpah, the departing widow, and we will move on quicker through these thoughts. Verses 14 and 15 we read, they lifted up their voice and wept again. Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clave unto her. She said, Behold, thy sister-in-law is gone back to her people, unto her gods. Return thou after thy sister-in-law. So Orpah, she sees Naomi. And she sees Naomi initially heading for the house of bread, for Bethlehem. Undoubtedly, Naomi's talked about home. Undoubtedly, Naomi has missed home. And it seems here that Orpah, she is stirred up by all that she has heard. And twice here you actually read of Orpah kissing her mother-in-law. Now, in Bible times, there were three different types of kiss. The Jews, they observed three different types of kiss. The first was a reverence, a kiss of reverence to honor a person of dignity. 1 Samuel chapter 10, you see this, where of course maybe kings hold out the hand, as it were, and individuals, they make obeisance. They, as it were, kiss the hand. There is also the kiss of friendship, and the New Testament speaks of this. Greet one another with an holy kiss. But there is also the kiss of parting. The kiss of farewell and the kiss of goodbye. And it seems that this is what Orpah's doing. It's that last kiss farewell, that last kiss goodbye. She recognizes she's never going probably to see her mother-in-law again. And so she kisses her goodbye. Her name Orpah actually means stubborn or back of the neck. And it's really the thought of the oxen that sees the yoke and it's stubborn. It harns its neck to the yoke. And what I want you to see is this, is that there was an initial following of Naomi. And there was even an initial emotional response. She cried. She cried. But after a while, we read in probably one of the most heartbreaking verses of Scripture, in verse 15, where Naomi says to Ruth, Behold, thy sister-in-law is gone back. Just let that sink in. She's gone back. Gone back to her gods. Gone back to her old habits, her old way of life. She sees perhaps, yes, all of the blessings, the possible blessings of the house of bread, but she sees the buffetings as well. She looks at the journey. She looks at what it means, how she's going to have to change her life, obey the Lord, follow the Lord, worship the Lord, etc. And so it seems she weighs it all up in her mind, Orpah. And she goes back. She turns back from following the Lord after a while. And you know, some do this in the professing church, and perhaps this is you. You make that initial indication that you're going to follow the Lord, that you're going to walk with the Lord, you're going to go whithersoever the Lamb leads you. But you know, after a while, you kind of weigh it all up, and you kind of ask yourself the question, is it really worth it? You look at, yes, the possible blessings, but also the possible hardships. And really, when you weigh up what it is to be a Christian, and you weigh up your old lovers, your old lifestyle, your old habits, old lusts, you turn back. And whenever you turn back, what you're really evidencing is that you've never been a true follower of the Lord. Because you're showing that you'd rather have your sin than have the Savior. You think of John chapter 6, after Jesus was seeing great crowds and great droves come to him. I mean, after all, he fed 15, probably 20,000 in the wilderness. That's a quarter of Portadown. That's a fair amount of people following you. But after they saw that this was not just an external thing, and it's not just about bread and fish, John 6 verse 67 we read, From that time many went back and walked no more with him. Many. The vast majority of those thousands that were flocking to Christ, what was left in the book of Acts? 120. 120 out of 15,000. Many. When they saw what Christianity was really like, when they saw what it really meant to follow Jesus Christ, many departed. The question for you this morning that you need to consider is this. Will you leave like Orpah? Will you cleave like Ruth? Will you leave like Orpah? Will you cleave like Ruth? And I just say that following Jesus Christ is always worth it. It's always worth it. Always. Because even when you go through hardships, and look, sadly this is the last we ever hear about Orpah, but undoubtedly Orpah had her hardships in Moab. But the thing about it is this, Ruth went on to have her kinsman redeemer with her in her hardships. Orpah didn't. Orpah was alone as she dealt with the hardships. Will you leave her, Cleve? I'm sure that many of you have heard of the Mississippi River. Name Mississippi simply means big. Big river. It's a big river. But in 1811, when you read of there was an earthquake that hit Missouri State, and that actually had a strange effect on the river. And for a short period of time, the river's direction, its flow was interrupted, and it actually went backwards. The river went backwards. Rivers aren't designed to go backwards, as you well know. But it went backwards. When you are saved, you're designed to go forwards. But the question is this, will my friend, will you be like Orpah and go back on that initial profession that you have made? Ruth, the discouraging widow, Orpah, the departing widow. Lastly and quickly, think with me about Ruth, the deciding widow. Ruth, the deciding widow. Verse 16 and 17 we read, Ruth said, entreat me not to leave thee, or from following after thee. Whither thou goest, I will go. Where thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, thy God, my God. Where thou diest, I will die, and there will I be buried. The Lord do so to me, more also, if aught but death part thee and me. Someone has said that true faith in Jesus Christ always leads to action. And that's exactly what we find here with Ruth. She has a true faith in the Lord, she has a true faith in Jesus Christ, and it has stirred her to action. Moab, of course, was cursed, and yet when you think about it, where was she going? The house of bread, Bethlehem. She was leaving a place of spiritual darkness. The god Chemosh was worshipped in Moab at this time. And she was going to where God was worshipped, the one true and living God. And she makes this great declaration of faith. Thy people, Naomi, shall be my people. Thy God shall be my God. Verse 14 puts it this way. Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clave to her. Now this term clave, it's not just indicative of Ruth and her relationship with her mother-in-law. It's good to have close bonds with mother-in-laws, like Ruth. This is a good example. This is a good example, a Christian example to follow. Ruth clave to her mother-in-law. But it's not just here a kind of a natural relationship. Ruth here is cleaving to the Lord. Now what does this term cleave actually mean? In Psalm 63 verse 8 it's translated followeth hard. Psalm 119 it's translated stuck. And it's actually the same phrase used in Proverbs 18 verse 24. There's a friend that sticketh closer than a brother. A friend that cleaves closer than a brother. You see the sense here in Ruth? She's sticking hard to the Lord. She's following close to the Lord. She's cleaving to the Lord. She's following hard after the Lord. It was this term that actually was used in instituting the first marriage, Genesis 2:24. For this cause shall a man leave his family and cleave to his wife. Stick to his wife. Ruth deciding to cleave to her mother-in-law, she was indicating here her love for her mother-in-law's Lord. Your Lord, your God's going to be my God. Your people, the Lord's people, are going to be my people. So she leaves home. She worships a new God. She imbibes a new way of life. And she even thinks about death in a new way as well. She wants to be buried. She wants to be buried. Buried. Not disposed of in a pagan way, but she wants to be buried. And that's where we get our principle of Christian burial from. One of the ways anyway. And so we ask you the question just as we finish. Are you receiving, believing, and cleaving today? Because this is what salvation is. It's a complete new way of life. It's a new love. You love the Lord. It's a new loyalty. You're loyal to the Lord and to his people. There is that new life where you know that the joy of being sustained in the house of bread. Jesus Christ, who is the bread of life, he sustains you, he satisfies you. The things of Moab, the things of this world, you're not running after the Washpot, as it were, anymore. You're following after the Lord. And so which widow are we today? Are we Ruth? believing and cleaving? Are we Naomi and we're discouraging others? Or are we Orpah and turning back from following the Lord? 3 widows.